Hi, Sherry.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
You're sitting by the same blue wall or aqua.
That's right. I never leave.
I wonder if we move at all.
Only when my dogs bother me. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, Sherry.
Hi, how are you? You're sitting by the same blue wall or aqua.
Whoops. I've got all of my.
I wonder if we move at all.
Only when my dogs bother me. Only when my dogs bother me. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, Sherry.
Hi, how are you? You're sitting by the same blue wall or aqua.
Whoops. I've got all of my. This is awful. Only when my dogs bother me. Only when my dogs bother me. I'm going to share my screen here. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? You're sitting by the same blue wall or aqua.
Whoops. I've got all of my. This is awful. Only when my dogs bother me. There. Oh my gosh. That was awful. Okay. That screen. There we go. It's not working.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Commissioner.
Hello, Commissioner.
Oh.
Fred, F-R-E-D, Nolan, N-O-L-A-N.
Nice job, Fred.
Sorry, I'm actually listening to the commissioner's call in and recording it so I can blog on it. I was wondering where you would be, Commissioner, there or on the call in today.
That's right. That's why it's, reason number 107 that it's wonderful having a team, a
Yes,
really talented team,
yes.
so that I can very confidently say, I'll be with the school
I'll
finance.
start my call here.
Others will very confidently say, we've got the school leader call.
Yes, no, and you do. And so
Yeah.
I have a contract with ICS to blog about stuff for their COVID, for their customers. They got like 70 or 80 customers. So doing two things at once, but there's an app where you can actually record phone calls. So
Wow.
yeah,
I mean, there's an app for everything. So
yeah.
I should not be surprised. That's right.
Don, that's quite the background. Where is that?
See, I walked to, hey, Bernie. My wife teases me because I can weave into every conversation that our son is in med school. That's Dartmouth, where he goes to med school.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
He's a third year, and currently, we sent him out Monday night to San Francisco. So he's doing his rotation in psychiatry for the next month in San Francisco.
Nice.
Yeah. So we FaceTimed, I guess what you would say, on his walk home last night. And it was an orange background,
Oh,
from
yeah,
a virus. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, man.
that's not good.
It was, he did his OB rotation in August, and they have a lot of fertility in that city. He assisted on 25 deliveries.
Whew.
A lot of babies being born.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to report that kids are back in the classroom and schools are back alive. It's pretty awesome.
That's great.
That is a great report, Steve.
Yeah, we actually, maybe you're aware, we had the governor in Forest Lake on Tuesday for our first day, and I think he's missed his calling. He should be back in the classroom. He's doing a great job as governor. I wouldn't take that away from him, but he's a natural with kids. It was a lot of fun.
That's fantastic.
Okay, this is John. I'm just going through the list and wanted to make sure everybody's name was on there, just to make sure we got the members in the room, because I do see somebody with Christine's iPhone with a K, but I don't recall having a Christine as a member. So I'm wondering who that person might be, because might be
I
using
am
somebody
Christine
else's phone.
Anderson from School Finance.
Oh, okay. Great. Then the Association of Metropolitan School Districts. Wondering who that person is. Well, they may not be paying attention right now, so that's fine.
Well, it says they're still connecting.
They were the first one who came on, so I'm not sure.
Hmm.
It would be, but okay. Okay, just letting in another person here. We can get started. Here comes Maria. And it looks like the live stream is working, so that's a success right there. So I'm happy that's working out for people, as long as they have the link. Okay. All right, it looks like we could probably get started. I'm just going to start out with just, well, here comes Christine. Just letting everybody know what the full agenda looks like here today. So just put that up on the screen. We'll start by just welcoming you today, and we might have a few words from the commissioner, and then Fred is going to present some of the information that's on the draft that you all got via email. And then we'll have some breakout rooms to reflect on that. And then we'll have some, Christine and Sherry are going to interview Fred on some of the other information on the rest of the report, just to give you some sense of what is on that piece. And then thinking about all of us, if we were to be interviewed by somebody about this, what would we say? So it's kind of getting familiar with the message on what's on these pages, and thinking about too what, how we'll get this message and market it to other stakeholders. So that's kind of the agenda today, what we'll get through. And Mary Catherine, did you have any words to say to people before we get started?
Yeah, thank you so much, John. Thanks everybody for joining. I really hope the YouTube link is working well. We are getting to that point where we really do need to have our working group members able to interact with each other and make sure that we're asking questions. Of course, we are getting to a decision-making point as well about what it is we want to put forward. And we still want to make sure that everybody who wants to be observers of the school finance working group have that opportunity as well. So we're really looking to use this technology tonight, one, to just troubleshoot, to also test it out to make sure things are working. And then let me just talk a little bit about that point about getting to that decision-making point. We have been alluding to this through much of August, that we've been at this for just about a month or a year now. Reminder, we spent last September and October looking at those perennial pressure points, those broad pressure points in school finance, the ones so many of our school systems are experiencing, some of the more pernicious pressure points where perhaps we've made some progress, but there's more progress to be made. And then we spent time starting in November pulling together case studies that really give us a glimpse at those pressure points in action. That friction between the pressure point and our urgency to better meet the needs of students, hearing directly from school leaders and practitioners in the field, going through that. And then this summer, as we finished looking at some of those pressure points, looking at some of that friction, we started formulating ideas, pulling some of those ideas from this winter into the same place so we could start looking at what this could look like as a body of work. And that's really where we are right now. There are no decisions that have been made. We are still actively, as a school finance working group, talking to each other, asking each other questions, making sure we understand, again, this idea of messaging. Part of it is, can you explain it? Do you feel confident talking about the solutions that are being proposed right now and how they relate to those pressure points? and how they will release some of that pressure. And if not, what do we need to do to go at it again? What do we need to, more information do you need? I have access, we have access to an incredibly talented school finance team. We have access to each other and the expertise we've all brought, the lens we bring to those pressure points and to that friction that we experience. And so I really expect, I'm really looking forward to today's agenda and being able to dig in a little more, get some of those questions asked. Please make sure that if you have comments, if you have questions, if you have ideas, bring them forward. We're moving ourselves toward a decision-making point. And so we're gonna be testing a lot of things during all of this time. And we're gonna be doing it the same week so many people went back to school, welcome students back in one form or the other. So I have to imagine that a lot of folks, it's Thursday afternoon, we are running on empty, but I'm going to ask you to dig deep. And you've been so committed to this work for a year. Let's use this time to sort of test some of these ideas, test the questions we have for each other. We're going to see a great opportunity in that. Fred has agreed to be interviewed by Christine and Sherry. I'm really looking forward to that. So with that said, let's dig in. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks, Commissioner. All right, if we have, I'm going to share my document here of the draft that has been put together. You all have a copy of that, but you can look at either one. But I'm going to turn it over to Fred, and he can share whatever he'd like to, and I'll just try to keep up with whatever you're referencing on this document.
Well, John, if you'd back up to the table of contents.
Sure.
Committee, I'm humbly doing this work. I've re-retired and have the opportunity and the time. And I know everybody else is extremely busy, and I appreciate this opportunity. And you won't insult me by making edits and suggestions. That's the way I always work. In the table of contents, I just wanted to point out that this patterns after other reports where you have a transmission letter and then an executive summary, which we'll write last, and then a background statement about the work group. So you just see some topics that are going to be in that chapter. Then 4 and 5, we've chosen to lay out the 10 principles for education funding before laying out the general context for the report, but we'd be open to switching that around as you go through it. Then the biggest change is the 80-20-10 basic revenue redefined. You see the page numbers there. The other parts have been written, and I'm not sure, John, when you'll be sending that out, but that just shows you how far we are. If you go down a little bit, scroll up just a little bit, please, John. Okay. Facility levies would come later after formula simplification. And then a section, chapter 11 there, on how this 80-20-10 reform package addresses racial equity. That was a slide we had 2 weeks ago. We're actually asking the department to pull some numbers together, to put some student numbers to some of the formulas and how they affect children of color. And I also understand we're going to have a report, I think, from Bernie Burnham later about some of the work that's directly being done on this, which would probably be another section up in the pressure points document. Then pulling the conclusions together, and then a whole bunch of appendices. So there's much to be done, but I just wanted to point out there's some options here, and that the table of contents is kind of an important place to put all these pieces together to make sure we're not missing a piece. Okay. So John, if you'd go to the next page, please. This is our 10 principles for education funding. And after the discussion about racial equity, we thought we should make a direct appeal to that in number 2 here by making sure we're clear that unique student and district characteristics, including but not limited to racial and SES demographics, and which vary among schools and support statewide principles, including closing the opportunity achievement gap. So we think that pulls it together. Those number 1, 2, and 3 are the most important principles in that order, okay? And I won't read them to you, but the general education funding needs to be at a level sufficient to ensure all public schools can carry out their mission. And we point out that that's not the case today. 2, basic funding should address all these categoricals. And we point out it doesn't do it today. And finally, local community should have the opportunity to raise a limited amount of additional revenue. Today, it's not as limited. It's at 27% of the basic revenue. We're hoping to limit that. 4 through 10 kind of get into more of the how-to principles, not the what we want principle. And so I would take any questions. I would point out number 7. I'd be interested in anybody who can help us edit that down to a shorter statement. The first sentence deals with districts that are below the average tax base, and the second sentence deals with districts that are at the average tax base. I haven't had time to really wordsmith this, but it seems so much longer than the others. It'd be nice if we could get it down to about half the length. So if anybody has some good wordsmithing or comes up with it during our discussion, I'd be very open to that. It just looks wordy, and I think people get lost in it. John, if you'd kind of go to the next page, please. Now here again, I need some advice as the drafter. The first paragraph, for those who are familiar with it and understand what the big plan was and what the Minnesota Miracle was, and the Minnesota Miracle had a general education levy that funded about 30% of all school finance, and it was equalized by the state funding 70%, so the tax rate was the same across the state. And the big plan in 2020 replaced that with the thought that the state, from sales and income and capital gains and a statewide business property tax called the general, not quite sure what it's called, but that's what it is. We're going to replace all that. And I characterize that as almost magical thinking 20 years later, because it never did, okay? And so I'd be open to whether I put more detail in there or simply assume people know what we're talking about. It would probably take about 2 paragraphs to say what I just said. And so again, would want some feedback on that, because you're always dealing with who's reading this, who's the audience, what's going to make sense without being so lengthy no one will ever pick it up. So again, I would be very interested in some information there. Then we go into the second part of this paragraph that says that the Minnesota funding of education has drifted downward relative to inflation in comparison of any other states, relied more on variable funding, and that 20-year drift downward is the theme of the rest of the page. But at the same time, we say our outcomes have stagnated, we've got a large persistent achievement gap, and the percentage of children of color more than doubled in those 20 years. So it sort of sets out, we've made this move to this big plan. We thought the state could fund it 100%. We're facing these challenges, and then the bullet points. And the bullet points are intended that wherever you look at it, however you look at it, it's been a drift downward. And I hope the conclusion is, without having to say it, is if we expect to have the best education in the nation, to have a world's best workforce, okay, and allow funding to continue to drift, that's fantasy thinking. And so now, if we have to make that more explicit, maybe not using the word fantasy thinking, but clearly that is not going to get the job done, we can do that. And I'd be open to any questions about any of this data. There'll be end notes in this report about where all this data came from. But I sort of want the overwhelming impression that our current system just isn't getting the job done. So those are the first 3 pages, and I think that's where you wanted me to stop at this point, John.
Yeah, I think that's a good stopping point. And then people can, I'm sorry, all of a sudden my dog started making noise on on my roof. I'm in the basement. So I apologize for that, but this might be a good point for Bernie Burnham to give an update on what your group is doing about equity and those discussions and what you might be presenting next time, just to give people a little bigger picture of what.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. Thank you, John. Yeah, just a summary of the conversations we've been having for the last couple of weeks. We talked about, coming up with some kind of racial equity formula, and talked about per pupil based on schools enrollment of kids in protected classes. So one of two ways: a concentrated formula where you have to have a minimum of 20% of students in the protected class, or a flat rate formula, which would ensure that all districts and charters could be included and qualify in that. So we've looked at some numbers around that. We know that we need to really focus on, excuse me here. Someone wants to talk to me really bad. We are concerned about our support personnel and how we ensure that we have enough folks in those areas, such as school nurses, psychologists, social workers, counselors, and chemical dependency areas. We feel like our numbers in the state of Minnesota do not match, what the national standards are for that. So something we've talked about is how do we ensure there's funding for that, and then build that up over a 5-year period, so that our school districts get what they need. Fred was kind enough to share, again, there was the Teacher of Color Act that was proposed and didn't really get any traction, but it is something that we all believe in and signed off on, and hopefully that, this will be a part of what we do, but we know that that's really important. And he and I talked about a little bit about, mostly people say teachers of color is important, but we also believe in our group that, all of the support personnel, while they are listed under teachers, often our narrow focus is just teachers in the classroom, but we feel that everybody in the school should reflect the population of our students. And it's not just about areas where there are the concentration of students of color is high. I think, from my own personal perspective, we know that white students benefit just as well from people of color being in their schools as students of color do. So it's important that we ensure we support people of color as they come into our profession, and that they get mentoring, and that they have the support they need to want to stay, because we know oftentimes we get people of color into our systems and it just becomes very difficult for them for a variety of reasons as to why they don't stay in the profession. So with our teacher shortage and our shortage of personnel all over the state, we've got to make sure that through our funding, we support people as they come in. What else can I tell you that we've talked about? We talked a lot about the racial discipline gap and the impact of ACEs on our students. So as we go forward, we need to make sure that we have professional development that meets the needs of our personnel in buildings. So you need to make sure that they are aware of and understand the impact of ACEs and how to work with that. We need to make sure that we talk about implicit bias, because we know that all of the cultural competency and things that we have in place now need to be better. And it can't be just a one-year thing. I mean, that often happens where we highlight it and we get some folks trained, and then it kind of goes by the wayside, unfortunately, because the funding goes away. And so how do we ensure that we have proper funding for professional development as well? We've talked about having trauma-informed restorative schools and full-service community schools. And so all of that ties together, and we feel that everything that we've talked about really will impact the achievement gap, and with a focus on racial equity, ensuring that our students of color, no matter where they live, get the resources that they need. So that's a quick, brief summary of what we've been talking about, and we will have a presentation ready next Thursday for everybody.
Great, thank you, Bernie. We'll look forward to that. So according to our agenda, we're going to be looking at these first 3 pages that Fred just went over, and thinking about what's in there, reflecting on it. And I've got a couple of questions that I'd like you to think about when we go into breakout rooms. Now I'm going to split you up into 3 or 4 in a group where you can have some discussions about these things and see where you're at. You know, what are things that you might agree with? What are things you might want to edit? Kind of coming together as a group to kind of talk about those things. But also thinking about kind of what some of the things that Bernie is bringing up too, and how are we thinking about equity? And so there are 2 questions here on the shared document. I'll make them a little bigger here. So how are you aligning with the thinking with edits, but then how could any of these 10 principles we looked at or statements in the context worsen disparities or uphold racist, oppressive, or marginalized practices in a way that they might be interpreted or enacted? So kind of thinking about how these things, you know, one way they look on paper, but how do they look once they're actually enacted in real life? So thinking about all of those things as you discuss, and then we're going to break for about 20 minutes, so you get some time to really dig into some of these things, and then we'll have some time when you come back to come together as a group and share some of your thoughts. So if you could get at least one person who can report out what your group talked about, that would be really helpful. Any questions about that before we get into groups?
John, when you put everyone in groups, is there a way that in the chat, maybe you could just repost the 10 principles just in the chat so people can kind of have them handy?
Sure, I could do that.
I know it might be a little bulky for inside the chat, but it might
I'm
just help.
also putting in my 2 questions, but I'll put the 10 principles in there as well. Any other comments or questions before we get into groups? Okay, we'll see you in about 20 minutes. Hi, Terry, you just joined. Everybody just got into breakout rooms. So,
Oh, so I'm just gonna hold back because I don't know what's going on. I'm gonna
Okay.
be here a little late, so don't assign me to one. I'll look stupid.
okay. And Christine, did you want to go into a breakout room?
Hi, John. I'm working on my phone, so it's really hard for me to see anything or like change anything.
Okay. Okay. Hi, John. This is John Gimple. You just joined our meeting.
Yes, I did.
Hi. Everyone is in breakout rooms right now.
Okay.
And is this John Vento?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay, great. If you don't mind changing, if you know how to put your last name on your screen.
Oh, hold on. I'm lovely on my phone right now. So
Okay. It's not a huge deal. People, as long as we all know who we are, that's the big thing.
no, I hear you. And I'm trying to see what I can do here with settings.
But I will put you in one of the breakout rooms. I'll explain to you what they're doing in there.
Where the heck is settings?
Oh, here it is.
In the parking lot right now and trying to get this figured
Yeah,
out.
usually if you go to the participant list, if you can get access to that, you should be able, there's a little more menu by your name and you can go to.
No, and I clicked more and it's got chat, meeting settings, I bet, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure on the phone what it says, but on a computer it just says rename, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. I'd rather get you into the breakout room.
Okay. Yep,
Everybody
no, thank
talking
you, John.
Yeah, we're just talking about the first 3 pages of that document we sent out about the 10 principles and then some of the context that Fred went over. I'll put you.
I will listen and then we'll get back up to speed quickly because obviously I don't have the papers in front of me right now.
Okay. Let's see. Unassigned. Oh, there we go. All right, I'm going to throw you into a room here.
Thank you, John.
So, John, there should be a message on your phone that you have to click on to get to the room.
All right, hold on here.
them.
Did I get it all in, Sherry?
Almost. Nice going, Bernie.
Yeah, I tried.
Good conversation.
Sounds like you had to talk real quick at the last minute there.
Yep.
We did that too.
I think everybody's back. Looks like it. Okay, well, welcome back. I hope that was time well spent to discuss some of these things. Now we have some time just to share what some of your thoughts were. And I would just like to have everybody think about what your group talked about, what you shared that might be important to you, may not get shared out to the large group. I want to put everybody's attention on that and just make sure that if you have a thought that you want communicated, make sure that you get that to the right person. So if it's an edit that you think Fred needs to know about, make sure you send that to Fred, just to guarantee that your thoughts get communicated. So you're not relying on somebody else. But if we do have a spokesperson for your group, at least you get the basic ideas about what you talked about, and we'll share that with the bigger group. So I unfortunately closed my group, so I don't remember who the groups were here. I'm going to open that back up. So we have you may not know your group number, but group number 1 was Bernie, Kathy, Sherry, and Jim. Who would like to share from that group? Looks like you didn't pick a spokesperson.
Well, this is Jim Dabney. I'll take a shot at it.
Thanks, Jim.
We checked in a little bit on point number 3 on the 10 principles about what did we mean by local priorities. We reviewed the 80-20-10 concept and felt like maybe there was a little bit more room for better understanding that. Talked a little bit about some of the challenges of fitting one formula system across the entire state and how sensitive is it to different local conditions, and wrapped up with the big question of this is a lot of money and a big ask. And it wasn't quite phrased this way, but certainly the way I thought about it was, how do we, within this big ask, establish priorities once we recognize that this is a multiple year, multiple session, multiple election cycle job to do. I'll let my colleagues tell you where I was wrong or what I missed.
I think that was a great summary. Thank you. Really a conversation about making sure that we are remembering equity in this time that we're in right now with distance learning and hybrid and some of the things that are coming out of that really made us think about, what we do here can have an impact on that. And much of our conversation was about competing interests and how, whether that's competing interests within this group and how we bring everyone along on some kind of glide slope, but also competing interests that we'll face when we bring this forward to the legislature. Our example was transportation. But we think we can talk about the critical needs of education. But thank you. And that was a good summary.
Great, thank you. Breakout room 2 is Chris, Christine, Don, and Tom.
We also didn't pick a spokesperson. If you like, I did take some notes so I can start, and then I'll just let the others kind of fill in if you guys are okay with that. So our group, Don brought up a really good point, that because the beginning of this talks about the basic general education formula, and it talks about quality for students without special needs in districts without unique high cost factors. One of the concerns was that we don't want special education needs to get lost in this. We also talked about the fact that we all understand that special education and EL learners are also general ed students. They are included in that category as well. But does that first principle imply somehow, if someone just cracks this open and starts to read, that somehow those groups are being overlooked, even though we know what's coming later in the document? We also know that it could give an initial first impression. So there was conversation about changing it to without special needs to just all students. But again, I understand the reason for this being distinguished here, but just a thought, just at first glance, because people are going to read this and they are going to look at first glance. A second thing, Chris had brought up that the comprehensiveness of this package is really a strong point to it, this whole package together, and that it answers a lot of questions about each of the different conversations that we have. We also talked about the fact that even as well put together as that is, once it gets in the hands of the legislature, it could very likely be picked apart and certain things will be advocated for, and it won't necessarily stay glued together as a whole package. And we may or may not have control over that, but we just kind of had a little side conversation about that piece as well. So, but again, we came back to that same equity conversation and how do we make sure that we are, from the very beginning of this, putting a strong statement that all learners are important in this situation. So I don't know, Tom, Chris, or Don, do you want to add anything to what I just said?
No, that's well put. So if you look at the first principle, you can see why my first reaction was, well, it's already differentiating the children in special education. We could just edit that first sentence and say, well, we're trying to provide equal funding across the board for all students, without having to differentiate in the very first principle that we're leaving out of that principle the children with special ed and having to deal with that funding separately.
And I agree with Don. I think we could shorten that up and make it more focused by just starting with the word funding and then ending with students. And the other part I think could be confusing. We know what we meant when we read it, when we wrote it, but I think it would maybe help to make it more general.
Okay, so I can just be clear, put a period after students and just cross out the rest of the sentence.
Yes, and then also delete basic general education at the front. So it becomes a statement about overall funding, providing sufficient resources for all students. And then
got it. Okay. Okay.
This might be just a simple nuance. I'll jump in. I wasn't part of the committee. I apologize for jumping onto your turf here. But when we talk about all, we tend to lose each and every. And maybe it's every student versus all students.
I think that would be helpful too.
I like that too.
Okay. Thank you to that group. We'll have the group 3 share. That's Eugene and Fred. I thought there was another person in that group, but we'll just go with
Janie was on her way to class with Nicola Alexander, so she shared a little bit, and Jean has those comments.
Yep. One of the things I think came up first was that while this plan doesn't, this whole package doesn't deal directly with teachers of color, that there should, and funding for that, there should be some linkage to this aspect, because that is an important piece of this all. Second thing we talked about was looking at all the statistics in the drop-down part of that one page, that really there needs to be more specific actual amounts rather than just percentages. Because, for example, if the percentage, if you start with $1 and 20%, that's 20 cents. But if you start with 10 million, 20% is 2 million. So actual numbers versus just percentages will have much more impact than a percentage, because people don't know what you're really talking about. So our recommendation was to put actual dollar amounts on some of these 20-year differences in terms of funding. Another thing we talked about was in terms of the 10 principles, moving up the 10th principle about simplification to after the first three, because really it's about simplifying both the top three and then all the levy pieces of it. And so it'd be the connection piece in terms of rather than an endpoint. And then let's see, checking my notes here. Oh, the question of providing some more information about like the Minnesota Miracle and the big plan, that there should be some, at least statement of what the intent of those things were, rather than just say the big plan, which most people aren't going to know what you're talking about. But you don't need to go into detail about what they were as much as what the intent of those efforts were. And that got into the question of who are the readers of this document, to make sure that it's clear, whoever we see as the audience has enough information so that it does tell the story.
Great, thanks, Gene.
Just with regard to defining some of those terms, I think Sean made a very good point early on in the chat where he suggested, for example, that we have a little more background on the Minnesota Miracle, or we could add the big plan and into an appendix, that perhaps we could have it in an appendix and then do a footnote here to refer people back to that for more information about what the Minnesota Miracle was or what the big plan was, without having the report get really long in the body here.
We were not proposing that it be more than a sentence or two that just says the intent was to, like the Minnesota Miracle was to shift funding to the state from local districts or whatever the actual intent was.
Yeah, I think we can do both.
Yeah.
All right, super, thank you. Breakout group 4 was John, Mary Catherine, and Michelle.
Well, this is John, and I represent finance managers, business managers, and I think what resonates or what will resonate with our group really is 1, 5, and 8. So anytime we have adequate, and then it's keeping up over time with inflation, those are big priorities, and so highly agree with those. Commissioner, we talked a little bit about making sure that it's emphasized, and I do see it in point 1 with all public schools. So we really want to make sure that it's meant that this is public education funding, not other types of schools, private, basically. And then we talked a little bit, one minor edit maybe in point 3 was, instead of saying a limited amount of additional revenue, maybe a modest amount of additional revenue. Anytime you kind of use language like limiting, then I get anxious. What does limiting mean? So, but the intent is if point 1 and 5 and 8 are being hit, we aren't going to need to go to our local taxpayers for these votes as often anyway to ask for more funding. And then I guess just in the context, we really liked the factual based statements on the page 3 too. Like we didn't really have much for suggestions there because I think we thought you just put out the facts, and however they are, they should be received and show what's been happening over time. So
great, thank you, John.
I would just add one of the conversations we had just that is absent in the principles, but perhaps suggested in them, but ideas to pursue, and that is the work you do in a school budget. Like we got to it in number 5 about predictability, and just quite frankly, how there are not a lot of dots you have to connect, and how predictable funding is actually a way to equitably meet the needs of students. because if a school board, if a state can deliver predictable funding to a school board, then school leaders and educators can have consistency in the programming they're providing to students that provides predictability to the school experience for students, right? Like that's important. But sort of the next piece of that is smoothing out highs and particularly lows. And are there ways school finance can do that? I know in other states they'll use, for example, a 3-year average of student enrollment to sort of help ameliorate some of those drops. That got us in our group, that got us on a bit of a discussion about this year's worries school leaders have about enrollment drops with kindergarten students who perhaps are not enrolling this year, perhaps taking their chances next year instead. And is a principle of school funding also to just help smooth out those real lows and that may be experienced. And that's not as explicit here as like a number 5, that predictability.
Okay.
All right, well, we have one group left. Breakout 5 is John, Sean, and Steve.
I can jump in, and I'm sure others will elaborate. We spent quite a bit of time, Fred, on your initial question tonight around items 7 and 8. And the topic and discussion was that the equalization is such a fundamental part of the work that we're doing, and making sure that equalization keeps up over time and that it's fair. So as much as you're looking for simplification, perhaps of 7, we need to, I think, be able to provide for the legislature, as well as any other audience reading this, understanding the magnitude and the importance of equalization, so that we don't lose the critical opportunity that equalization provides here by providing equitable opportunities for districts and for kids. So I think that's a really critical piece to drill home, to not lose the urgency of making sure equalization works. We spent some time talking about the equalization work that Bernie talked about earlier with respect to the different categorical groups, as well as our different students of color groups, and making sure we're providing adequate resources for students, whether that's through counseling services, teachers of color resources, etc. So quite a bit of discussion there as well.
Yeah, I'll just hop in real quickly. And I guess to the second question here, in terms of how those 10 principles, worsen or may uphold, I guess I would be curious to see that in terms of the impact of the equalization so each new dollar, how that ends up getting distributed across the state based on, where our students of color are going and attending schools. So if we're recommending a large equalization shift, and this is a pretty large impact, I guess my question would be, for each new dollar, how are those coming down and impacting, our students of color? And I think part of our discussion in our subcommittee earlier in the week was just identifying, how widely differing our districts are in terms of students they serve. And so that would be a question that I would want to see in terms of the impact of making that move.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. Steve? So if we think about our agenda going forward here, we have interviews still to take a look at, but we have some time if you wanted to just reflect. Because actually I missed about 10 minutes in there in the agenda, so I apologize for that. But any last words about anything that was spoken, or if you have just a reply to somebody's idea?
I took a lot of notes, so I appreciate all the input, and we'll be working on a second draft. Tom has been my reader, so I'm sure he took notes as well.
I'd love to just echo, I think, what John Carlson said about making sure this is clear, this is public education. I know that it kind of feels like that should go without saying, but given some of the challenges we're currently facing in our COVID pandemic world and supports with non-publics and things, it might be good just to keep that clear. There's a lot of pressure to privatize public education.
And John, maybe before the Q&A, I could go through pages 4 and 5 and 6, because as Chair Davney said, it probably needs some more. And there's a whole piece here about the effects that we didn't go into because we don't have our district run yet. But it might help if I go through those 3 pages before the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, whatever you think is best. I'll pull that up. Start with page 4.
Go there.
Is that where you'd like to start?
Sure, are we ready?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Here's where some choices get between how long and how condensed. I felt this this chart that Tom has put together was absolutely necessary, so people could see the erosion of the basic formula right now. And we're calling this the single biggest issue that we're addressing, in part because it's the biggest dollar amount, but also it affects every kid across the state in terms of basic revenue. The first bullet down there about state average operating referendum, the average kind of hides some things. So I pointed out that 1/3 of the districts have 0 and over a quarter have over 900. Now I can put a map in there that would actually show that. But again, the question is that worth it? It gets a little longer. There may be a reason to come to it because there may be a map that would show the new distribution in the second part. Then we get into the recommendation, which is basically to restore the basic revenue to at least 60% of all general ed revenue, and doing that by bringing the property tax back in a way that is equalized, but doesn't have major losers as if we were to go back to a general ed levy. Now, I didn't put that in there, okay, but that's part of the subtext here. And the idea being that we can no longer think that 100% income and sales and capital gains tax is going to fund schools. And then if you'd go to the next page, Tom has this chart here about the decline of the percentage of basic revenue of all general ed. And he's added that little thing there, which shows back to 60%. So people visually can see, okay, yeah, this is a start. Maybe it's not everything, but it's a start. And then it goes through the redefinition, which I can talk about more in the Q&A. But I would like to point out in D, to go from where we are right now, from 65.67 to 85.40 is a $1,249 increase, which is significant for many districts across the state. And then if you go to the next page, John. So the section that's missing would come under all this, would say the effects or the advantages, some kind of title about this. And the first one is, while Representative Davney said, yeah, 646 million is a lot of money. If we were to continue the same system and put all of that on the state education formula, it'd really be 1.1 billion. Okay, so we're repurposing a fair share of operating referendum money into calling it basic revenue and moving it over to a board approved referendum. We could also, I think Tom could probably simulate the 5th to 95th report. I'm hoping, Tom, you could do that. That would show what this would actually do to it. And to go back to if we just put 1.1 billion on the formula, we'd still end up with a 20% variability due to the operating referendum. Now here we could do a map of revenue increase, and we could see what that would do across the state, but also understand there's going to be tax impacts. Those 105 districts, or whatever the number is, 110, I think, with 0 operating referendum, they're going to see a tax increase by their boards. But we can talk about why that might work. I mean, the LOR, which is right now at 724, we now have 98% of districts levying the full amount. There's only 11 that do not, and that was as of 2019. Maybe as of 2021, 2022, 2021, we have the numbers, but I don't have them. It may even be a smaller amount. And also, if you look at the Gallup poll, people give nationally schools a low mark, but they give their own school a high mark. So if the local property tax is indeed local, it's not statewide gen ed, there may be more acceptance of it. So I think we could make the case in more of an effects part about here's the effects of it, which you can't see right now because we haven't developed any runs yet. So I just wanted to point out that this is not complete. I'd be open to other suggestions of how to make it more clear. But maybe we do the Q&A and then go to that and say, okay, whatever you said, Fred, you ought to write that down. And this is all unrehearsed.
Yeah. So yeah, we're putting Fred on the spot, just like any of us could be put on the spot if we were asked a question about this. And how does the messaging come out of us when asked? So that's kind of where we want to visualize that a little bit. So Christine and Jerry, if you'd like to ask 1 or 2 questions, we'll see how this goes.
I've got several. I'm sure you do too, Sherry. I'll just start with one. One of the things we've talked about is the fact that last time we met, we had a big discussion of the 80-20-10 and went really in deep with all of that. But I wanted to bring us back to, as we start looking at our final meetings here with this group, we need to be able to articulate on a dime what we talked about. And so I'm going to give you a real softball question here, Fred, but my goal is that we keep it short. If you're in an elevator with somebody and you only have between the 1st floor and the 5th floor to tell them what 80-20-10 means, tell us. And remember, this is an elevator, Fred. You got to say it quickly. I want to make sure that for all of us here, if someone says to you, what is this I hear? We've got the short answer and the really quick, easy way to explain it.
Sure, great question. I would start by saying that for the last 20 years, we've drifted downward in education finance, and the basic revenue has not kept up with inflation. And we've tried to fund schools 100% with state funding and allowed local levies, voter approved, without equalization. And so we have the highest levies in the wealthiest communities and 100 districts with nothing in terms of revenue beyond the basic formula. And so what we're trying to do is create a more even playing field across the state for everyone and bring back the local property tax equalized so people have an equal tax burden, and let the local officials, the school boards, make the decision about what basic revenue they need. And it increases basic revenue, recovers that inflation, and makes it predictable into the future. That's the 80-20 portion, 80% state aid, 20% equalized local levy, dramatically increases, restores basic revenue back to where it was in 2011.
All right, I think I'm on the 5th floor of that elevator and holding the door open. So we're gonna keep pushing ourselves to think of how to say that.
Yep.
You know, but I love it. And that's exactly what we need to be able to do. Explain it briefly and understand the general gist behind it.
Right.
All right, Sherry, I'll let you go next, and then I'll do one after that.
Okay, Fred, you're still on the elevator. Now we're going to continue up to the 12th floor. And I just want a quick statement about how this realizes the different communities and needs we have with districts. How is this going to be sensitive to those districts?
Well, first, you need to get everybody up to a livable point so you're not robbing from Peter to pay Paul within a district, okay? And we're not there yet. That's what people are doing. They're having extra large class sizes at certain grade levels so they can serve students with higher needs. And this gets everybody to a more level playing field. And then the second thing is we have 15 or 20 pressure points starting with SPED, ELL, and going on from there that address specific needs. And that's the second principle we have, is to address those needs where children are unique and different across the state.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead, Christine.
Next question for you, Fred. How would you respond to somebody who comes to you and says, okay, and by the way, I'm going to just insert, this plan is on so many levels brilliant. There's so many elements of it that are just really quite amazing and thoughtfully put together. It's just kind of amazing. However, and how would you respond to somebody who says, okay, Fred, this seems like a great plan, but there's also an assumption that people perceive that the gap between low and high referendum districts is inequitable, but it's not necessarily taking into account the higher labor costs. As Nicola Alexander's presentation showed us, that the buying power is different also. And so how would you handle that challenge, as I'm sure would come up with this proposal?
Well, it's interesting you should bring that up, because the Center for Rural Policy and Development just this summer came out with how rural wages go farther. And so it's clearly a real issue. And Nicola Anderson's and Alexander's study from 4 or 5 years ago actually created an index that I think, when updated, will actually provide for those districts across the state. It's not just the metro. If you look at it, with additional buying power, so that their, whether it's special ed aid, or whether it's basic revenue aid, or whether it's operating referendum money, is not diminished by a loss of buying power as to what part of the state they're in and what the wage costs are in that part. I thought it was interesting that the Center for Rural Policy and Development actually sort of inversely confirmed her analysis from a couple of years ago.
And I like what you said too, because it's not just Greater Minnesota versus Metro, because some of the districts in her study were not Metro districts that she said had the loss of the higher labor costs. So I just think that that's going to be a challenging question, and I think we need to be able to really speak to that.
Right. And I think she does a nice job with the 3-year average, dealing with county wage rates and regional wage rates and state wage rates. Mm-hmm. And so I think she did a good job there.
All right, Fred. Some school boards really had a hard time getting their heads around LOR. And how would you explain to a board member in that same elevator, now I'll give you just 2 floors, what the value of using a local education revenue would be?
Well, we believe in local control. You're a school board, you're an elected official. I've heard oftentimes that school boards complain that the counties can raise levies and the school board can't. Well, guess what? In order to have the levies accepted by your community, they'll need to be imposed locally. And we're providing you the allowance so that you can have basic revenue at 60% of all the revenue you're receiving but 20% of it needs to come locally. Now we're equalizing it so that taxpayers across the state for average and below districts don't pay more per property wealth than a more wealthy community. But we found in 20 years ago that people are not accepting a statewide property tax. And so you're it. And so local control, you need to figure out how you can provide the best possible education. You'll do it efficiently, and you'll decide how much of that local education revenue you need. It's not optional, it's part of basic revenue, but how much do you need, and can make that as good as it can be, and refine it, and you get to choose how much you put on.
Thank you.
I was looking for a word that says they can without the word manipulate, but they can move it up and down, and I was struggling for a word there. So if somebody can come with that, they can target it. Maybe they can target it to the right amount of money that they need to provide the best education.
I like that. Target sounds good. I'll
I
write
agree.
that down for our notes.
I have another one. Many people, our eyes are on this task force of ours, and many people are waiting with bated breath to see what's going to come out of this. I know you talked earlier about to what extent should you explain that Minnesota Miracle. Personally, I think it should be explained because people don't, it gets tossed around a lot, but it's not always understood by everybody. So Fred, how can you tell us how this proposal package put together here is similar to and or differs from the Minnesota Miracle?
Okay, may need Tom's help here, but the Minnesota Miracle took what was primarily a
I'm going to add, you're in an elevator again, and it's going to be short.
In the 60s, when schools consolidated, when the one-room schoolhouses became part of independent school districts, local property taxes supported them, and there was huge inequities across the state. And so the Minnesota Miracle created this general education levy, which was running about 21% of ANTC across the state. And whatever amount that raised, the state would fill in the rest of it to get to what the basic allowance was, okay? And so it actually lowered taxes across the state for many, many districts, all right? And that went fine until around 2000, when we had the Truth in Taxation hearing and people were pointing fingers at each other, and we elected Jesse Ventura, and we decided, hey, the state's got lots of money. It was bringing in money in income taxes, and the state's going to fund education, and we'll take it off the backs of the taxpayers. Didn't work. We've drifted downwards for 20 years, but we can't go back to the general education levy, first of all, because philosophically, I don't think it'd be accepted. And secondly, we get large property tax increases in many communities who have fairly good wealth. But what we can do is build on something called local optional revenue, make it part of basic revenue, and have the local school board step up to the plate and target how much funding they need of the basic revenue.
Okay, I still think we need to condense that answer, but
Yep.
we'll keep working on it, because I agree. And I think
I've been chastised at the witness table for talking too long.
Well, and one of the things, and no, I love hearing it. I think it's good for this group too. But one thing we all have to get really good at is how do we explain this to a layperson who doesn't understand school finance at all, right? So, you know, a real simple way is defining the portion. It used to be all on local taxpayers. Then it was at a state between both, but in a more equalized fashion, or however we want to describe it. But like in real easy terms, like when you're talking to your grandma about it, right?
Right.
No disrespect to grandmas, because there's some really highly educated and intelligent grandmas out there. I'm just as a scenario.
If I could add to what Fred said about the Minnesota Miracle, just briefly, that the Minnesota Miracle was a dramatic increase in the basic general education funding. It was trying to replace essentially unequalized local property taxes, which varied widely among school districts, with a major increase in the general education formula, so that it was sufficient for basically every district in the state to provide a quality education with the general education funding. And this is fairly similar. It's just not as dramatic. You know, we talked about how basic formula used to be 70% of education revenue. We're talking about increasing it from 50% to 60%. So you would have to do a much bigger change. arguably beyond our means to do a change the size of the Minnesota Miracle. But this moves in the same direction. It's trying to raise that basic formula when we combine this new local education revenue with the existing basic formula up to a level so that most districts are able to provide a quality education with that formula without requiring voter approval to get there.
Thank you, everybody. I'll probably have to interrupt here just because we're getting lower on time. I do want to point out in the comments that Don brought up when you were talking about the first question of the 80-20-10, he said, well, what about the 10? So in some way that didn't come out perhaps as well as he had hoped. So everybody, one of the things we wanted people to think about here is, what is the best catchphrase for this? Is 80-20-10 going to be something that people get? Is it too hard to explain, or is that just the thing we need? Or, just wanted people to think about that and generate any ideas you have to make it more catchy. What are some phrases we can use and all of that kind of stuff. So thank you for all your work here to kind of generate some of those thoughts.
Yes, and Don, when I was answering, it was Christine's question, I think. I was focusing on basic revenue. But yeah, the 10 is what the local folks can raise above that, again, equalized for local needs. And Representative Davney said, well, what is that? Well, there's some schools that have a lot of inclusion. I mean, not inclusion, but classes that are, language classes. What are those things called? Chinese immersion. There we go. Immersion. Some communities want immersion classes. Well, that's something that the local taxpayers can say, yeah, we want that and we're willing to pay for it. But it's limited to 10% of the basic revenue. So the gap between the communities that want more things is smaller, and basic revenue is more uniform across the state. But that'd be a separate elevator. Like, okay, what is the 10%? Yeah.
All right, thank you. So the last thing we want to do, I think, before we go is just kind of set up what the next couple of meetings are going to look like. We've got our kind of wrap ups, our what this document's going to look like, what our agreements are around it, and how we're going to vote on a final product. So does anyone want to speak to that? Mary Catherine, maybe, do you want to just speak?
Sure, I can start. And then if Christine and Sherry want to have anything to add, I want to make sure they can jump in, because the three of us, and actually John's been really wonderful. We've been talking about our decision-making process and how we do make decisions going forward. If you remember way back at the beginning, we had Superintendent Les Fujitaki give us a few examples of how decisions have been made in the past. The use of the clickers. We also practiced an idea where you can text your decision in. We have also talked about using this time to really vet the ideas for people to give, perhaps to give their opinions on sort of yes or no to different ideas and going through them, but then ultimately sending out a decision-making list for you and having you decide sort of decision by decision after that discussion period. And then of course we report out on everybody's decisions, because we do want to get to that point. I know like today we did, because Fred has done a considerable amount of work helping to put it in a draft form, what it could look like. We still don't have a universal yes on this as a proposal going forward. This is a proposal we are very actively vetting right now, which is incredibly important, because we want to feel as a group we have vetted something really well. But we haven't done a show of hands or any sort of voting on this yet, because we really want to make sure that you are feeling not just comfortable, but confident in the proposals for school finance, for spending, for distributing funds to our schools. you feel confident in those proposals going forward, as well as the principles, what we are trying to solve and the vision we have, what we are actually trying to do for our school systems. And so that leads to, again, a really robust conversation and our desire for robust conversation. And then it does lead to questions about how do we want to come to those conclusions? How do we want to take those votes and make sure people feel like, yes, I endorsed this idea, and yes, I endorsed this amended idea moving forward. So Sherry or Christine, do either of you want to add anything to some of the conversations we've been having there?
I think the importance of
Go ahead, Sherry.
The discussions we've had, the breakout session, as well as the Q&A and brief overview that Fred just gave us, is really to start to ask questions and be able to explain this, dig more deeply into it, so that we'll be able to figure out where we have those connections and what is going to work for us, what you can buy into and stand behind. So it's really important that we all reflect on this document at the start of it, and think about what questions we have before next week when we meet. I think it's next week when we meet again. And maybe we'll even try to reach out and ask people individually, how you're feeling with the document or changes and such. And then we do need a way to sell it. I mean, we were sort of kidding with Fred about that elevator speech, but we do need a way to, in very succinct terms, be able to explain this, or we'll be sunk before we start. So I really appreciate you coming together and helping with this process, and we will work on this, and we will find something we can agree on. So, Christine?
Yeah, I'll just add to it that I just want to say that there are no dumb questions here. I think we all have sat through many, many, many hours of these meetings, and there's times where it feels like there's a lot of information, and I feel like what we need to do right now is be checking for understanding. And one way to do that is to turn and talk, tell somebody else what you just heard, and see if you can articulate it. As you listen to Fred or you listen to Tom, there's a lot of information. There's a lot of financial jargon in there. And I think what we want to continue to do is get better at really being able to just nail down what it is we're trying to do, what's different, what the proposals include. And we all know that in order to talk to other groups of people outside of this committee here, we got to be able to explain this. So we're going to push really hard on that. Don't ever feel bad if you're like, okay, can I just back up? This question may seem really, really basic, but like, I never understood that one thing we talked about months ago. And could someone just explain that to me? And I think we all have to just take real liberal license to do that, because it's perfectly okay to back it up and say, we talked about that 4 months ago. I didn't want to interrupt the presentation, but I didn't get that part. Or, you know what I mean? It's perfectly okay. We have to really, really build a trusting conversation where we can really have those pieces talked about openly.
Say, Christine, I've got a quick question, and maybe for the commissioner as well. Is our charge and task to create a recommendation for the legislature? And if so, then
The governor.
For the governor.
And the lieutenant governor for them to consider. Yeah.
Okay. Then is simplification all that critical? I mean, certainly we needed a working knowledge. We need to understand our recommendation, but we're bringing this to a sophisticated body, and being the governor, the lieutenant governor, ultimately perhaps to the legislature, not the general public per se. And school finance is complex in its nature, and not that it shouldn't be simplified, but I think we should give ourselves, if that's true, permission to have some complexity here, so we don't lose the. I think we might all agree we don't want to lose the essence of what we're proposing here in the simplification.
I agree, and let me just clarify. Thank you for bringing that up, Steve, because I'm not suggesting the document in any way be altered to be written in simple speak. I'm not even suggesting that the formulas themselves, you know, I'm not always even a fan of simplifying formulas too much, because sometimes oversimplification of a formula creates all new inequities. I totally believe that the layers that get added on, the caveats and the variables within funding formulas are usually there for a reason, to correct some inequity that a general formula would create in its own existence. So totally agree with you on that. I guess what I'm trying to talk about here is just, I want to make sure everyone in this group here, sitting here, working together, feels like they understand and have their questions asked. And I think because we all are coming to the table with all different experiences, a lot of us know parts of this, but we all, like a system, we don't all see the whole system. So the first part is I want to make sure, and that's why I was pushing Fred to just say it in simple speak, just here, to make sure everybody in this room understands it. You can go back and back it up with all the terminology that we have in this document. But absolutely, and when you're talking to the legislature and you're talking to a school finance group, and there's no reason to simplify anything in explaining this, but I do think that, you know, there's a lot of people who need it. There's even, I mean, even when we present at the legislature, we sometimes have to be careful when we speak that we don't throw in too much jargon that's going to lose some people when we need their votes and we need them behind a concept. So it's just being able to do both, and by no means simplifying the document or even the formulas. It's just making sure we can speak about it.
Right, good.
Thank you for bringing that up. I'm glad you've clarified that.
All right, thank you, everyone. And the last thing I would just say is I do have a longer document that Fred and Tom have put together. Now, we're already making changes to this document from some of the thoughts today, but I can still get that out to people tomorrow so they can start looking at it. And if that makes sense to everybody, especially Fred and Tom. And then if you have a refreshed document, we can send that one out too. I think not, instead of posting it, we'll just send it to the members here to look at. If that makes sense.
Yes, and excellent, because the next set has to do with all the pressure points, except the facility ones. It's goes through the ones in the table of contents that have page numbers. And yes, we'll start working on revising the first 6 pages. Thank you so much for your feedback. But yes, I would echo what John said, that this is in draft form. And if we start forwarding it around, people are going to have different impressions, and we haven't completed our work yet. So
great. I'll try to get that out to people by tomorrow.
Thank you, John.
All right, I think we've gone plenty of time here, so I'm going to adjourn the meeting unless anybody has any last words, but that's that. All right, well, thank you for everybody for being here. We'll see you next time.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Have a good night.